Hi, are you ready for today's science lesson? I know I am. Today we're talking about cell transport. There is a lot to cover in this, but I'm going to try to break it down so hopefully you'll be an expert by the end. Okay, remember the cell membrane? We talked about this when we talked about cells, okay? And we talked about all the organelles in a cell. And do you remember what the function of the cell membrane is? Well, the primary function, again, it controls what gets into and what gets out of the cell. It's the barrier. It holds all the stuff inside and keeps out, hopefully, anything that would damage the cell. Now, the cell membrane is selectively permeable. Big words, selectively permeable. And you can look in these illustrations, you can see some things like little particles, like especially gases, can just cross the membrane easy peasy, in and out as needed. Other molecules that are small, like water, for example, can get in pretty easily, can cross through the membrane, but sometimes it's hard for them. Then we have bigger molecules like glucose, which in terms of molecules is still a pretty small one. It can only get through sometimes, and most of the time it's too big. And then we have ions and anything else that's larger, which simply just can't get through that cell membrane. So what does selectively permeable mean? It means some things can get across the cell membrane, but others cannot. And primarily, it's based on size. Little things can cross easily. Bigger things just cannot. The cell membrane is flexible. Whoa, might be a little weird to think about, but the cell membrane is not just that line you drew around the outside of the cell. It moves and shifts and changes. So what does being flexible mean? It means it's not rigid. It's not stuck in place. It can actually move. So our cell membrane is selectively permeable, controls what gets in and what gets out. Some stuff can, some stuff can't, and it's flexible. Are there any other things we need to know about the cell membrane? You betcha. It's a bilayer. Bi means two. So it is two layers of something called a phospholipid. And here is this cool looking thing called a phospholipid. Look, it has this part at the top called the head and these two parts at the bottom called the tails. Here's the thing. The head loves water. It's this word called hydrophilic. It means water lover. And the tails are hydrophobic. They hate water, literally means scared of it. Hydrophobic. So what happens, because in our body's mostly made of water, more than 50%. So the part that loves water needs to be on the outside. So if you can see in this picture, all of the heads of the phospholipids face the outside. All of the heads of the phospholipids face the inside in that bilayer. So here and here. And then sandwiched in between are those water-hating hydrophobic tails. And this is how the cell membrane is set up and functions. So two layers, a bilayer of phospholipids. Lipids, as a side note, are fats. But on top of all that, on top of being selectively permeable, controlling what gets in and what gets out, and being flexible and being a bilayer, it's not even just phospholipids. So what does that mean? It has lots of other parts. Look at this. It's these proteins and carbohydrates, all kinds of things stuck in different places in the cell membrane. In fact, because of that, the cell membrane is called the fluid mosaic. Here's an example of a mosaic. A mosaic, all these little pieces put together to make the big picture. So the cell membrane is called the fluid because it moves. Remember, it's flexible. And mosaic because it has all these pieces. So again, it's called a fluid mosaic. So here's a little snapshot. We have the watery environment outside the cell, the watery environment inside the cell. That's the cytoplasm. Then we have this bilayer, the heads of the phospholipids facing inside, the heads of the phospholipids facing outside, the tail sandwiched between. Then all these proteins and carbohydrates stuck in a flexible membrane that controls what gets in and what gets out, that's selectively permeable and helps us function, every single cell. So now that we know a little bit more about the membrane, we're going to talk about transport. So how do cells really get their stuff inside and outside? So we know things like nutrients and waste have to get into and out of the cell. We remember that. That's part of the reason cells just can't keep growing forever. But how are those things going to get across the cell membrane, the things we need? So remember this process? This would be diffusion, where these are, in this case, they're little, but they can go from high concentration to low concentration and move into the cell. Easy peasy. It's not always so easy, though. Okay, so let's look at this chart. This covers all of cell transport. So two main categories of cell transport, passive and active. So let's cover passive first. Passive transport doesn't need any energy. The cell doesn't have to do anything to make it happen. It just happens on its own. And those particles in passive transport move from high concentration to low concentration. They move from where there's a lot of particles to where there's very few. Okay? And there's three examples of passive transport. First is diffusion. And diffusion is when particles simply move from high to low concentration just straight across the cell membrane. And it happens for mostly gases and sometimes for water, just right across the cell membrane. So small molecules can just diffuse, or by the process of diffusion, cross the cell membrane from high to low concentration. And then sometimes we have to use facilitated diffusion. That's kind of a big word, facilitated. Well, to facilitate means to help. So that means something needs a helper to get across the cell membrane, but it's still going to go from high concentration to low concentration. So we have a lot of glucose in our blood, for example, and the cells need it. So there's going to be a protein in the cell membrane that's like a helper. Like imagine like a mom or dad or grandma or aunt or uncle holding a little kid's hand to cross the street, helping. So facilitated diffusion is like that. There's a protein in the cell membrane that just helps that molecule get across. And then the last example of passive transport is osmosis. And osmosis is the diffusion of water. So we know what diffusion is, moving high to low concentration without adding energy. Well, osmosis is that, but it's only referring to water. Okay? So there we have passive transport, no energy needed, high to low concentration, that's how the particles move, and diffusion, facilitated diffusion, remember the helper, we need a protein in the membrane to help it, and then osmosis specifically for water. So now let's move on to active transport. Active, okay, sounds like you know when you're active, okay? Active requires energy. So in order to be active, you need energy. And the opposite is going to happen. It's going to move from low to high concentration. It's going to go against the way of passive transport. And there are three main types of active transport. First, we have pumps. So we have proteins that are in the cell membrane, just like for facilitated diffusion. But these pumps need energy, and the cell energy is called ATP. And these transport proteins carry or move the molecules across. So it's not just holding someone's hand, you got to pick them up and carry them across. Okay, so pumps are still proteins, but they need energy called ATP, and they're going to help carry molecules across the cell membrane. And then sometimes it's too big. So say I'm a bacteria and I need to engulf and surround some food, or I'm a white blood cell and I need to engulf and surround a bacteria and take care of it. We use a process called endocytosis, and this takes a lot of energy too. Remember, the cell energy is called ATP, and endo means in. So large particles get moved into a cell. What happens is the cell membrane comes up around, surrounds what needs to come in, and pulls it into the cell in a structure called a vesicle. So the cell membrane goes around, closes around the substance, pulls it into a vesicle. And then the cell can do what it needs. If it was nutrition, it's going to break it down and use it. If it was a bacteria and it was a white blood cell, it's going to break it down, okay, so that it can't damage anything else. Sometimes we need to get stuff out of a cell, so wastes primarily, but also a cell might be making a protein or a hormone, and they need to get it out of the cell. It can't stay stuck in the cell forever, so what's going to happen? The opposite of endocytosis. So exo is like exit. Okay? In exocytosis, big particles or a vesicle filled with a bunch of particles like hormones or proteins. Okay? That vesicle is going to move close to the cell membrane, fuse with it, and then open up and let its contents outside of the cell. So a vesicle is going to move close to the cell membrane, fuse with the membrane, and then open up and let all of its contents outside of the cell. So active transport, again, requires energy. It moves things from low to high concentration. So, and that's why it requires energy. And three main types: pumps, proteins in the membrane, moving molecules, carrying molecules across; endocytosis, bringing big things in; exocytosis, pushing things out of the cell. So there you have it. Cell transport. There's passive, there's active, there's osmosis, pumps, the membrane, concentration, exocytosis, endocytosis, energy. Oh my goodness, so much information, but it's so exciting. Cell transport. Hopefully, you're a little bit more of an expert now.